episode 270.
Bang. Gotta love that. I'll tell you what, we still got news in front of us, John, but I will leak this. I'll just say this. Hey, Chris, we're coming at you. You and Julie and the gang, giddy up, baby. All right, here we go.
That's right. It's going to be a fun time, guys. A lot of good stuff coming, and we certainly appreciate Julie and Chris, all the work you guys have done. But we're not going to say who they're with just yet.
It's just Chris and Julie, you know.
Just Chris and Julie. Just Chris and Julie. All right, folks. Episode 270 of The Rebel's Edge coming at you now. Pete Najarian and I, that's Pete over there, and Jared, who you don't see, but frequently you do hear from Jared in the background, either with boring or more than anything, you hear that boring. You also hear, thank you. You also hear from Jared with the fantastic futures, and we've got a surprise clip from the Pat McAfee show that we'll be sharing with you guys as well. So, Pete, you ready to get started?
Let's do it.
Let's get started with the macro minute, Pete. Macro minute. We always love talking macro, don't we, Pete? That's why we only give it a minute.
That's right.
So, macro minute. United Airlines tumbles 8%. They do blame pricier fuel, but they also say the Middle East and the conflict over there is cutting into their profits. Are they just the first of many to warn that this war is not a good thing, Pete, for the markets?
Yes, is the answer to that question. And by the way, from a macro standpoint, we're already through, and I know it's early, John. We've only been into this earnings season for a few days, actually, but 10% of the S&P is already reported up to now. So it's, on the macro side of things, we're starting to see a little bit of leakage, a little bit of problems facing the markets. And that's kind of what we've been dealing with now for the last couple of days here, where we've watched the markets kind of not really play off so well. We'll see if that changes in the next couple of earnings. We've got some biggies tonight as well.
Yeah, and let's hope, Pete, that the plunge protection team, when the market rallies back, that they sell some of what they bought. Yeah. Otherwise, just buying on every dip ain't going to help them. And eventually, they're going to have to let a lot of that go. All right, let's talk about fantastic futures, Pete.
Fantastic futures.
Well, crude oil this far from 90 so far today, Pete, and the 10-year at 4.9. Those are futures, plural, two of them. That's pretty not fantastic in both cases.
Well, not fantastic, but it's something that's fairly predictable, I would say, based upon what's going on in the world and what we've done here in the U.S., but also what's going on out in the rest of the world. But, I look at the XLE, John. I know this is fantastic futures, but it's based upon crude. And when you look at crude, you look at energy in the sector XLE, 88 to 92. I mean, this thing has made a pretty nice run to the upside, very much like crude. And if we get up and through some of those upper levels, John, especially with crude prices, if we see 94 again, like we did not too terribly long ago, expect to see the XLE follow along as well. But we certainly are in an environment right now where it seems like we are destined to see it triple digits at some point. I don't know when, but at some point in the not too distant future.
Yeah. And again, if that war conflict in the Middle East accelerates and picks up more steam up north to Lebanon and so forth, not just on Gaza, that's going to be a real issue, Pete. And I suspect that the ships that use the straits there to get crude oil from point A to point B will be at higher risk. But we'll see. All right. Morgan Stanley, Pete, profits dropped 9%. Now, that's not as bad as Goldman, but nonetheless, the stock is down almost 9%. It's down 8%. And it's the largest single-day drop in more than 3 years, Pete. 3 years for Morgan Stanley. Now, their investment banking revenue down. I know you're going to talk about that, but these guys in Goldman seem to have been the ones that everybody else feasted on, wouldn't you say?
I would say that. And I'd also say, when you take a look at the chart of Morgan Stanley, it looks pretty murky, John. I mean, it looks pretty terrible is what it looks like. Hit 52-week lows today. Now, this is in a market that had a pretty nice move to the upside, earlier in the year. And as we've gotten now into the third quarter, now that we're getting into earnings and everything else, into the fourth quarter, I should say, now we're starting to see a little bit of bleeding, and it's coming from Morgan Stanley. You looked at Goldman Sachs yesterday. Their revenue was down 33%. We're down 27% on the revenue here at Morgan Stanley as well. Then you look at that IB. That just looks terrible. I mean, everywhere you look across, it's not a very impressive earnings, John, and that's going to be a problem because Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs, those are big names. We also had heard some good stuff earlier, JP Morgan and Bank of America, some of those names, but now we're starting to get a little bit deeper and it's not getting any better. As a matter of fact, it's kind of leaking down and getting just a little bit worse.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And when stocks are hitting 52-week lows, some of you who are bargain hunters would say, well, that's the time to buy. Things have changed pretty significantly in the last 3 months, not even just the last week or 10 days, Pete. So I'd say be a little careful before you dive into either of these. All right, let's talk about the maker of Tide, Pete. That would be Procter & Gamble. They said it was a clean quarter.
That's great.
You give people in Cincinnati too much time to come up with these lines, and that's what they come up with, a clean quarter. And by the way, we make Tide. Well, it was up 2% in the pre. It's still up 2% right now. Their CFO said China demand was choppy. He didn't say dirty, but he said choppy. And I suspect that you think it's the same, Pete, just kind of choppy, but steady over at PG.
Yeah, absolutely. And John, just about every single category that you look at that they presented to us had some growth. And that's pretty daggone impressive. You take a look at those earnings year over year. We talk about that all the time. It's not necessarily what was expected, but in this case, they beat the expectations. But those expectations were higher than a year ago, and they slaughtered what they did just a year ago. So they are doing everything right now. They seem to be in a great position. Matter of fact, you listen to that CEO when they said, well, how would you describe the quarter? He said, strong. I think that kind of says it all. These guys are doing extremely well, John. It's interesting to see how this is playing out, and any kind of positives coming from China would certainly give this thing another leg, another boost to the upside. And we have seen a little bit of upside options in there as well. So very interesting to see what's going on with Procter & Gamble. It's a damn good report.
Yeah, and, these aren't exactly high-end products either. I don't mean to criticize them. I'm just saying that these are non-durables, Pete. For instance, a washer dryer, that's durable. A car, that's a durable. Something like this over at Procter & Gamble is something people use up all the time, on a weekly, monthly basis, whether it's any of the products you look at Procter & Gamble. So that is something that people are still having to go out and spend on those products. They're spending more, but not enough to knock the pins out from under Procter & Gamble. All right, let's talk about Nvidia again, Pete, because it's erased $94 billion in market cap just since the president said, you know what, we're not going to be selling these chips over to China. Well, turns out they have a lot of business in China, Nvidia does. And it's now down almost 200 billion, Pete, 197 billion if I round it up to 200, but 197 billion from the August 24th high, which was, $502 or something like that. This is a really ugly thing happening to them. And just like we said yesterday, if it can't get back up through that 444, 445 level, this one's heading lower.
Yeah, it certainly looks that way, John. And it's one of those where I think we should all keep a very close eye on it. Obviously, we should also keep a close eye on what we're doing here in the U.S. in terms of what those kind of sanctions or whatever you want to call it that's going on with China right now and what Biden said. And quite honestly, it makes a lot of sense. I think the president did the right thing here, John. He's talking about trying to be safer for the military. A lot of these chips and so forth, whether it's Iran, Russia, or specifically in this case, China, Is China stockpiling these things? I mean, you just kind of wonder, right? All of this, that in the backdrop of all of the different wars that are going on, and there sure are a lot of them right now. It's not good at all. But does China start looking over at Taiwan again? I mean, at some point, we've all been waiting and looking and keeping an eye on this. Hopefully that's not the case, but certainly that's one of the things as well. So there's a lot going on. Nvidia's taken a pretty good hit here. Citi actually downgrade. They didn't downgrade it, but they did pull down the price target, John, of where they were. So that's another factor. They still have a buy, but they pulled that price target down based upon what's going on right now.
Absolutely. And as well, they should. You wouldn't respect the analyst if he or she would have moved their price up or kept it at the same level when the president's restricting sales to a very significant buyer.
Yeah.
All right, let's take a look at Spirit Aerosystems, Pete, because these guys make a lot of aircraft structures, and they just structured, you like that, a deal with Boeing, under which they're going to immediately receive funding from Boeing and revise prices for the 737 and 787 production. This caused the stock to trade like 25 million shares so far today, Pete. Normal is 3, so 8 times normal volume, and the stock's up 23%.
Yeah, and because of what they've struck this deal with Boeing, it also gives Boeing some rights to be able to have part of the decision-making process for Spirit as well. Pretty interesting, actually, when you really look at it that way. The cash burn here is really high, John. So is the short interest. I bring those up because of the fact of what you just said. 20 some odd % move to the upside. Why, was this that kind of a story? Well, maybe. But the reality is when you've got those shorts, they start to get a little bit nervous. They start to get squeezed a little bit. And I think that's part of the reason why we've seen this big jump in the stock as well, along with the volumes that you just discussed. Those volumes are extraordinary. We've talked about that in the past with many of the stocks, but this is a pretty big number relative to what their average daily volume would be. So big numbers, and for all the right reasons, in my opinion. This makes a lot of sense, though, I think, going forward. And now these two have created this partnership. It'll be interesting to watch how this unfolds over the next several years, let's say.
Yeah. Obviously, Boeing needs Spirit Air as much as Spirit Aerosystems, not the Spirit Airlines, folks. Mm-hmm. Spirit Aerosystems. They both need each other. So this seemed like a smart deal made by Boeing. It gives them some comfort with the 787 Dreamliner and some lower pricing for the 737 assembly, which will basically, I think, begin, Pete, end of 24 or beginning of 25, as far as the lower prices that they'll pay. All right. Let's, Pete, take a quick look at a Pat McAfee. One of his favorite guys, Aaron Rodgers. We talked about it yesterday. He pays his guests. I'm all for it. Ever since Lincoln freed the slaves, Pete, I think people should be paid for work that they do, especially if you're a daily or a very, very frequent guest. And that's what happens all over TV, folks. So whoever those sportscasters were that were so critical of that, they just don't understand that, people do get paid and they won't keep coming on if they don't get paid.
Right.
And on the other hand, people that you've never heard of will pay to be on TV. So anyway, this isn't about that controversy, though. It's about Aaron Rodgers calling out Mr. Fizer, which is also known as Travis Kelce Swift. So let's take a listen, Pete.
Mr. Fizer said he didn't think he would be in a vax war with me. Didn't think he'd be in a vax war with me. This ain't a war, homie. This is just conversation. But if you want to have some sort of duel, debate, have me on the podcast. Come on the show. Let's have a conversation. Let's do it like John Wick 4, right? So we both have a second.
Nice.
Right? So somebody to help us out. I'm going to take my man, RFK Jr.
Okay.
And he can have, Tony Fauci or some other pharmacrat.
Aaron Rodgers has told Travis Kelce, Mr. Fizer, now playfully yet challenges him to a debate. Aaron Rodgers and RFK Jr. versus Travis Kelce and Anthony Fauci. The pursuit of truth versus the pursuit of big pharma profits. I'll buy a ticket to that.
I'd buy a ticket to that too, Pete.
No matter what side you're on, it's you just have to appreciate, the classicness. And Pat McAfee's just sitting there, just kind of saying, "Hey, what do you guys got to say?" It's pretty interesting, isn't it? I mean, I'll tell you what, you can love Pat, you can hate Pat, but he's pretty daggone entertaining. And obviously, I'm not the only one who thinks that, because his ratings are through the roof. I mean, they're doing a great job. Yeah,
absolutely. And, I think you see the playful side of Aaron Rodgers there too, even though he's been demonized in the last year and a half, 2 years, for various stances that he's had. But I think that's pretty interesting. And he basically said, "Hey, you want to debate? Have me on your podcast with your bro." We should have him on this podcast, Pete, because we have, we'll show you guys a picture maybe tomorrow of us standing on the Cal football field with Mr. Aaron Rodgers, not with Mr. Fizer. That would have been on Cincinnati's field, Pete. Never been on that field.
No.
All right, Pete. What else do you have as far as NFL news?
Well, it's way too early, and that's why we're doing it, because that's what makes it so fun. But let's take a little bit of a grading system and, take a look at what's happening so far in the NFL in these first few weeks of the year. We're now through 6 and getting into 7. I think it's a pretty good time to take a look and just have a card out and say, hey, who really did do well last year in the draft? We got all these great pundits out there. Everybody out there has this idea about this, that, and the other. And Bryce Young and this and that. Well, Bryce Young and that team at Carolina, John, they're 0-6. Okay. And they did a lot of horse trading, so to speak, to get themselves into position to get Bryce Young at quarterback. It ain't working. And you know what? Does that mean it's going to be a failure forever? No. But early on, if you're going to draft a guy first pick, he's got to perform. That's not really happening. How about Arizona? They've got a whole bunch of draft picks. They did this, they did that. Have they gotten much better? Well, they're 1-5 right now. So I guess the answer would be no. And then you go to Denver. They're also 1-5. They're also awful. And they've been beaten down by just about everybody, particularly the Miami game, but it ain't just the Miami game. They've been beaten up pretty good, right? So then I go to Houston and the Texans. Now, these guys are completely forgotten by everybody, John, but they had some pretty high picks themselves. Now, how did they get there? Because the team was pretty awful. Got a brand new coach. They did a lot of changes. And all of a sudden you get a guy like C.J. Stroud from Ohio State, who, there was many quarterbacks. Everybody had their opinion on which one was the best. But when you really break down the numbers and you look around at somebody, I think that's where the important part is, the eye check. And this is my biggest criticism of general managers in the NFL. They all just have their pocket protector and they take a look at a stopwatch and they go, oh, yeah, that guy's pretty good. Look at that speed he's got. Well, is that the whole picture? I think you have to look at the film. You got to do the eye check when you're watching the guy do what he does. And so far, C.J. Stroud, how about this, John? You know how many interceptions he's thrown? Now, this is a rookie quarterback in the big leagues, and he's out there. He's thrown 1 interception so far this year. I'm not saying he's unbelievable. I'm not saying he's Aaron Rodgers, but he's got 9 touchdowns. He's got 1 interception. He's thrown for over 1,600 yards. And this guy has positioned them to be in a spot where they're 3-3, John. They've won 3 of the last 4 games that they've played. So this is a team that has really done a lot with what they did in the draft, what they did in free agency. Everybody has that opportunity. But they've put together a very competitive team that who knows? I mean, by the end of the year, if they keep this up, this could be potentially a team that gets into the playoffs. And when you consider where they came from and you look at those other teams, this is pretty impressive. And I like what we're seeing. And almost every one of their draft picks, the 2 linebackers from Alabama, they're contributing. They both start. One leads them in tackles. The other one's the sack guy. So, I mean, they've done almost everything right in Houston right now. So I'm giving them an A+ right now, John.
Yeah. And Pete, honestly, I don't think that Mr. Tepper had to trade up to get Bryce Young. The best pick in the draft was the gentleman you just described, C.J. Stroud from Ohio State, not the Alabama quarterback, Bryce Young. I am being critical of Bryce Young because of the performance so far. as far as a young man, he's probably a great guy. But if you're talking about a guy 5'10" and maybe 180 or whatever he is, he looks skinny and small out there.
He
Pete.
does.
You talk about CJ Stroud, you're talking about a kid 6'3" and like 215, I think, or something like that. You know, he's not a bodybuilder, but he's a bigger kid. And he's leading, like you said. As far as best draft, Philadelphia Eagles, hands down, because they got Jalen Carter, which just, you know, cements an already strong defense. Yeah. Yes, I know they lost for the first time this past weekend, just like San Francisco, who likewise has a great defense. But they got a great edge rusher out of this thing, Pete, that Nolan Smith, Tyler Steen, you know, this offensive tackle who's going to play a lot. And as far as teams that I liked also, other than, you know, of course, I had hoped for the Bears, but let's not even talk about them. Let's talk instead about Detroit Lions. They got your guy, Pete, the linebacker out of Iowa, and all that kid's been doing is stacking up bodies. His same name as the head coach, Campbell, so it's easy to remember. But that is one mean group of guys, Hutchinson and, you know, now Campbell and these guys. They've got a bunch of tough kids on that team. And I say kids because they're young. You know, Hutchinson's only what, Pete, 2 or 3 years out at most?
Yeah.
Michigan, and the kids lighten it up. So I really like the Detroit Lions draft, and I really liked Philadelphia Eagles draft. And I agree with you completely. There are a bunch at the bottom that why even talk about them?
Yeah. Well, and one other I'd add to that Detroit draft was Laporta, the tight end, also from Iowa, which is Iowa, you know, just puts out tight ends every freaking year. It's unbelievable how many are in the NFL and how good the guys that came out of Iowa are in the NFL. And Laporta, he doesn't look like a rookie either. The guy looks like he's been there, done that, and he looks like he's ready to go. Big, strong, fast. Tell you what, Michigan's got a bunch of tight ends, and I always hate to give credit to Michigan because as a Minnesota guy, I just have that in me. But I'll tell you what, Michigan's got some good tight ends again, and they always seem to have them. All right, next, John. How about this? I wonder how many people realize that the SEC is the home of Missouri. And, you know, because they were a Big 12 team forever. You remember going back 2012, they jumped over to the SEC. And they struggled to get going. They weren't an SEC style team. Well, they are now. And I'll tell you what, they're a lot of fun to watch. And so far this year, John, they have been crushing just about everybody. They're already a 6-1 football team. They beat 2 of the 3 ranked opponents that they had. They beat Kansas State, they beat Kentucky, but they lost to LSU in a shootout. Now, that sounds like a pretty good football team to me, and all they do is win, which is always a good thing. But you look at that offense, you understand why. They've got a quarterback, this kid Cook, 14 touchdowns, 3 interceptions, doing an amazing job. They've got a running back with 650 yards. He's only averaging almost 6 yards a carry in the SEC, and I know how everybody likes to put the SEC up here. Well, Missouri has found a way to be one of those teams that's up here, and they're very, very competitive. So I think it's worthwhile just pointing out you've got Alabama, you've got Georgia, of course. You've got Florida, you got LSU. Yep, you got Ole Miss, but you also got Missouri. And they are no longer a Big 12 team, but you're getting 2 more Big 12 teams next year. You're going to have Oklahoma and Texas joining that group as well. So I think the onslaught of the Big 12 coming over to the SEC, they are not going to be overwhelmed, John. As a matter of fact, I think the Big 12 teams that are moving over there are going to adjust very, very rapidly. And this is going to be a really interesting league then. Yeah.
Well, one of the teams, Pete, that for the last several years has been far more competitive, even scary at times, is Kentucky.
Yep.
You know, we've looked at them and seen that, you know, they had the quarterback last year that everybody thought, you know, this kid could break into the top quarterback slot in the draft even. They have a great offensive coordinator that's been doing a great job recruiting the right people to fit into the offense that they want to run in Kentucky. And when I say run, I really mean pass. That's what they're all about. There's other teams that are far more balanced, but Kentucky is one of those teams, Pete. And I think to a certain extent, Duke plays similar as far as they really want to throw the rock. And I love seeing that. Now, can they withstand the grind of the SEC schedule? That's tough. That's really tough. But they've been recruiting some pretty tough kids, and I haven't seen them really just absolutely fall apart. So I'd say that's a team to watch, especially if the odds get skewed one way or the other.
Yeah, for sure. And one thing I would point out about Duke, man, those guys play it on defense as well. You take a look at across the country, and you take a look at what they've done so far this year defensively, the number of points they've given up, how aggressive they play. That's a dang good football team on all sides of the ball. So these are no longer basketball schools and all the rest of it. I mean, we're talking about some teams that really play great football. It's pretty fun.
Yeah, it is fun. And like you said, Pac-10 probably got the best teams of up and down, and look at what Stanford did this past weekend. I know that my Buffalo kind of crapped in the cat box, but that notwithstanding, that team had a lot of grit to come back, especially at altitude, Pete, because teams usually fade against the Buffalo in the second half. USC did, which might have been a tell for their loss last week, the fact that they did fade so severely against the Buffalo. But yeah, I'm looking forward to another week of college football. That's for sure.
Yep. Sounds great.
Well, we'll be back tomorrow, folks, 1 p.m. Eastern time. Make sure you check us out. This show airs on Twitter, on marketrebellion.com/edge, on thestreet.com, Twitter, as well as I think Facebook. So we're about to make a big announcement middle of November, and we really appreciate all of you tuning in. Thank you.